I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase, the honeymoon phase, right? We often speak of the honeymoon phase in life. Most obviously, we know the honeymoon phase from early marriages. A couple gets married and then, hopefully immediately, they go off for a week or two on their honeymoon, on a vacation, a time to go and relax and be together and have fun. The honeymoon is indeed fun. It's easy. And the relationship is often new and exciting during the honeymoon. Of course, the honeymoon phase is called a phase because indeed it comes to an end. Sooner or later, that couple has to come home and back to work and back to cleaning the house and back to all the stresses of life. And the question is not whether their marriage can last through the honeymoon. Pretty much every marriage lasts through the honeymoon. The question is, can it last beyond that? Can it stand the test of time, the months and the years that follow? And as we know, although close to 100% of marriages last through the honeymoon, only about half of them last a lifetime. Now, Palm Sunday had me thinking about honeymoon phases, the other honeymoon phases of life, because it's not just new marriages that sometimes go through this honeymoon phase, but lots of things. You get a new job or you have a new friendship. There's a honeymoon phase where it's new and exciting and fun and everything is great. Eventually you get through that and have to deal with the reality of that relationship. We even speak of a honeymoon phase sometimes with new politicians in office, right? We tend to give politicians a few months before we get really cynical about their performance. Palm Sunday, like a honeymoon, is a celebration. It's exciting and fun. We just heard about Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. There's huge crowds who are adoring him, who are chanting about him. They're decorating his path, both with palm branches, but also even their own cloaks and coats, essentially making a kind of red carpet as he rides into the city on a young colt. His choice of this young colt is a reference to a Hebrew Bible prophecy that says that the promised Messiah, the promised King of the Jews, would ride into Jerusalem on an unbroken and unridden colt. And indeed, that's what's going on here. Jesus is being welcomed into the city the way that you would welcome a king. Whether a triumphant king come from a victorious battle or perhaps just your king finally visiting your locale. This is how ancient people in the Mediterranean welcomed their king. Jesus is being welcomed as the king, as the Messiah, the promised one. And that's where things start to go wrong. Because the expectation of the Messiah was that the Messiah would be a descendant of David, not just by blood, but that also this person would act like David, would rule and lead like David. Those of you who have read your 1st and 2nd Samuel will know that more than anything, David was famous for being a mighty warrior. He was really good at fighting battles. David's great achievement was unifying and strengthening Israel against its foreign enemies. For a short period of time under David and then his son Solomon, Israel was unified under one king. And many Jews then as now look back to that as the sort of zenith, the high point in Jewish history, when finally they had the strength and unity to resist all their foreign enemies. This is what the crowds are looking for. This is what they're hoping for. This is what they're expecting. Jesus is welcomed into the city because so many think that somehow he's going to gather together an army and he's going to drive these Romans back to where they came from. So what actually happens? To get ahead of ourselves a little bit, as we will discuss on Maundy Thursday, Jesus comes into the city with no sword and no army and certainly no crown. He meets with his students in a small little house in the city. And what does he do? He stoops down and he washes his own disciples' feet. This is not the behavior of a king. A king has someone wash his feet. A king does not bend down to wash someone else's feet. Jesus is not the Messiah that we humans were expecting. This is not the behavior we expect from a king. Jesus is no mighty warrior. He has no sword and he has no army. And so the crowds rapidly lose confidence in him and they turn on him, seeing him as a pretender. They thought he was the Messiah, and cryptically he had said that indeed he was the Messiah, and yet he's not acting very Messiah-like at all, is he? Palm Sunday is this great celebration, but the honeymoon ends quickly, and by Friday, some of the same people who had been shouting Hosanna as Jesus entered the city, some of them will be suggesting that Pilate should crucify this man. Many more are simply trying to get out of Dodge because they see that the Romans are cracking down on this Jesus, and they don't want to be around when the Romans pull their swords out. Now today, we've begun our service by reciting the actions of those crowds. You all have your palms, I hope, right? We've got our palm branches. We've been singing our hosannas, singing our hymns, singing our praises. But the question is Palm Sunday just a honeymoon, a day where we gather at church and we get kind of excited about Jesus? But then what happens next? Were we going to stay with Jesus in the days and weeks and months to come in life? Or are we going to fade away, get out of Dodge, like so many of his disciples did on Friday and Saturday? Because that's the thing. Today is fun, but we know that life gets tough, right? Life gets difficult. Ultimately, for everyone, life gets really difficult. Relationships will end, not only marriages, but friendships too. We'll get jobs that are difficult and taxing and anxiety-producing, and then we might lose that job. And as anxiety-producing as some jobs are, not having a job is even more anxiety-producing. The bills might add up. We will get sick. Our friends and family will get sick. And indeed, we know that we will lose some of our friends and family. And eventually, all of us know, we lose our own lives. Life gets difficult. Today we celebrate, but in the future we will have reasons to be less celebratory. And that's just it. Faith is easy when life is easy. But when problems arise, difficulties arise, suffering arises, that faith can easily retreat or even turn into bitterness. What's so interesting about the whole scene of Palm Sunday is that actually Jesus has been really clear. Not just that life in general is difficult, but that following him is actually going to make life even more difficult. Although so many people, and very likely even a number of his own disciples, assumed that Jesus was going to be this mighty king, Jesus never actually says that. Instead, he predicts his suffering and his death. The last few weeks, our gospel passages have been Jesus' teaching about where his destination ends. And it's not at a king's throne, but actually at the criminal's cross. But you may remember in those gospel passages, his disciples don't want to hear it. They argue with Jesus. Certainly, that can't be the way his story ends. You're supposed to be the great king. And so Peter and James and John and others resist Jesus' lesson. They don't want to hear that Jesus has to be crucified. They don't want to hear that he will be killed and buried. Jesus was honest, but we humans often don't want to hear the honest truth if it's inconvenient, right? Jesus has been clear with us. Not just that life is difficult, but that if we want to be his disciples, we're going to have to accept additional difficulty. We are called to speak the truth, even if we could get ahead by lying. We need to help those in need, even if that dollar I'm giving to someone on the street is a dollar that I could really use myself. Our faith calls us to fight injustice, even if that injustice benefits me or my group, even if fighting that injustice will be dangerous for me. Life is already difficult, but Christian faith calls us to actually seek out more difficulty and head towards it instead of away from it. Jesus sees the cross in Jerusalem, and he walks towards it, not away from it. And that's the question, I think, that Palm Sunday and that the entirety of Holy Week is asking us. If we celebrate Jesus today, are we going to actually stay on the path with him? Or will we abandon the path of discipleship the minute that life gets hard? But if that's our plan, that we're going to celebrate with Jesus as long as our faith is easy, we're not going to last very long. And to be honest, in that case, we're just wasting our time. Much like the honeymoon at the beginning of a marriage that only lasts for a few weeks. But if instead on these celebratory moments we were able to commit ourselves to following this strange king, this non-king king, then our celebration can indeed be something valuable and important and crucial. It can be a foundation that we build our faith on. A lifelong walk with Jesus. And the good news is we don't have to invent that faith ourselves. We know what this kind of faith looks like, this long-term faith. There are many examples, but I found myself reflecting on the history of the civil rights movement in this country. Growing up in the 80s and 90s and watching documentaries, I was sort of under the impression that the civil rights movement just sort of popped up somewhere around 1954, right? In my school, that was the first time the civil rights movement was mentioned, with Thurgood Marshall's famous arguments before the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education. Then I heard about some laws that were passed and some marches that someone named Martin Luther King Jr. led in the 60s, and ta-da, civil rights was achieved, and it's all fine now, right? I grew up in a white suburban school, okay, folks? Let's put our cards on the table. We know that history isn't quite right? Actually, Africans and African Americans have been struggling for their civil rights since the first day they were brought here against their will, going back as far back as 1619. More than 300 years before the landmark victories of the 50s and 60s. Generations of people were born and died enslaved. But what's so incredible is that for so many of them, their faith that things could be better, their faith in liberation, for many of them, not all, but for many of them, their faith specifically in the God of Jesus Christ didn't wane. In fact, all the oppression and suffering seemed to deepen and strengthen the faith of so many black Christians. They knew the story of the Exodus, that this God was a God of liberation, that the God that even the slave owners said they worshiped was a God who was on the side not of the slave owners, but of the enslaved. And so their faith deepened and strengthened. And in part, it was that deep bedrock of faith that gave the strength and the power and the focus of people like Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King Jr. and so many tens of thousands of much less famous activists who nevertheless did crucial work. The victories of the 1950s and the 1960s were built on centuries of organizing, preparation, training, commitment, and indeed of suffering. People like Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery and then yet turned around and went back into the danger to liberate others, right? It's as if someone somehow managed to wriggle off the cross and then came right back and got onto it. That's the sort of faith that Jesus is calling us to. And that's the sort of faith that so many civil rights leaders in this country have shown and continue to show, and that unfortunately will need to continue to be shown in this country as we actually struggle for real justice and liberation. This is the kind of faith that we need. The faith that allows us to deal with trouble and even to head into the trouble to do the work that God is calling us to do. But this is the faith that's hard. As we see from those crowds in and around Jerusalem, this is the faith that most of us ultimately don't have and don't really want. Who wants to head towards a cross? But this is the faith that we need. Today is a day to celebrate. You'll notice that I'm in red and not purple. And we're saying Hosanna, a word we tend to avoid during Lent. Today is a day to celebrate who Jesus was and who Jesus is. But let's make sure, my friends, that our celebration today is not just a honeymoon phase. Let's commit ourselves to this path, Jesus' path, this way of the cross, and decide to follow him through thick and thin alike. Holy Week, which begins today and culminates next Sunday on Easter, Holy Week is a great time to reflect and practice this deeper faith. And I invite you to join us for our Holy Week services this week, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and the Great Vigil of Easter on Holy Saturday. Every service at 6:30, in person and online. I invite you to join us in person or online. And as we walk with Jesus into the city, as we walk with Jesus through his last few days, we can deepen our faith and deepen our commitment to walking with him through the rest of our lives. My friends, may it be so. Amen.